The first time I met Jason, it wasn't supposed to be remarkable. It was a simple encounter, almost mundane. A wave across the driveway, a casual exchange about the weather, but there was something in the way he carried himself that stuck with me. He had this easy confidence, a crooked smile that seemed to know secrets I could only dream of. And when his best friend Eric showed up a few weeks later, I realized that Jason wasn't the only one with a magnetic pull. Eric was different. Where Jason was smooth and self-assured, Eric had a quieter kind of charm. Reserved, thoughtful, like he was holding back just enough to make you want to lean in closer. That's what I found myself doing, time and time again, as he started visiting more often. At first, it was harmless, friendly even. But the undercurrent of something else, a tension neither of us wanted to name, was always there. Jason often joked about Eric being the serious one, the kind who liked to observe, to think things through before diving in. "He's the brains, I'm the brawn," Jason would laugh, clapping Eric on the shoulder in that brotherly way men do when they're trying to be light-hearted. But I saw the way Eric's eyes would dart to me, just for a moment, before he'd look away. There was something unsaid in those glances, something that lingered long after the moment had passed. It was a Friday evening when Jason mentioned he'd be out of town for the weekend. "A work trip," he said, and then a grin. "Keep an eye on Eric for me, huh? Make sure he doesn't spend the whole weekend holed up with a book." I'd laughed, brushing it off as one of Jason's jokes, but the next day when the doorbell rang and I opened it to find Eric standing there, hands in his pockets, an almost hesitant smile on his face, I wondered if Jason had been serious after all. "I hope it's not too much trouble," Eric said, his voice soft but steady. "Jason mentioned you were around this weekend, and I thought, well, maybe I could stop by." "Not at all," I said quickly, stepping aside to let him in. "I was just about to make coffee. Do you want some?" He nodded, his smile warming as he stepped inside. I noticed the way he hesitated in the doorway, like he wasn't sure if he was intruding, and something about that made me want to put him at ease. Eric had always been polite, almost formal in a way that contrasted sharply with Jason's brashness. It was a quiet kind of charm that made you want to know what was going on behind those thoughtful eyes. As I moved around the kitchen, the sound of water boiling filling the space, Eric leaned against the counter, his posture relaxed, but his gaze following me. It wasn't intrusive, more curious, as though he was trying to figure me out. I felt it, the weight of his attention, and it made my movements feel deliberate, like I was performing for him without even realizing it. "You have a nice place," he said after a moment, his voice breaking the silence. "Jason's always talking about it." I smiled, glancing at him over my shoulder. Jason talks too much. That earned a soft chuckle from Eric, and when I turned to set a mug in front of him, our hands brushed, just briefly, but enough to send a flicker of something electric through me. He must have felt it too, because his eyes darted to mine, holding my gaze for just a beat longer than necessary before he looked away. "Sorry," he murmured, though there was no reason for him to apologize. The coffee was good, but the conversation was better. We talked about everything and nothing. Work, books, the little quirks Jason had that we both found amusing. It was easy, natural, and yet beneath it all there was that tension again, like a taut string humming just beneath the surface, waiting for someone to pluck it. When the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting the room in a warm, golden light, Eric leaned back in his chair, his posture finally relaxing. But his eyes, they were anything but relaxed. They were focused, intent, as though he was weighing something in his mind. "Do you ever get tired of it?" he asked suddenly, his voice quieter now. "Tired of what?" "Pretending." The word hung in the air between us, heavy with implications. He looked down at his hands, turning the mug in slow circles. I guess I'm just wondering if you ever feel like there's more. Something you can't quite say out loud." I didn't know how to answer at first. The honesty in his words caught me off guard, and for a moment all I could do was watch him. There was something raw in the way he sat there, like he'd stripped himself of all pretense and was daring me to do the same. "Yes," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. "Sometimes." His gaze lifted, meeting mine, and in that moment, it was like the air between us shifted. There was no more room for pretending, not when his eyes were so open, so vulnerable, and yet so full of something I couldn't name. "I thought so," he murmured. And then, almost as if he couldn't help himself, he reached across the table, his fingers brushing mine. The touch was light, tentative, but it sent a shiver through me, one I couldn't suppress even if I wanted to. "Eric," I started, but he shook his head, cutting me off with a look that was equal parts gentle and intense. "You don't have to say anything," he said. I needed you to know." I nodded, unsure of what to say, but his words hung in the air between us, fragile and unspoken, yet impossible to ignore. I let the moment stretch out, neither of us moving, as if one wrong word or motion might shatter whatever delicate thing we'd unearthed. "Jason trusts you," I said at last, though the words felt hollow even as I said them. I didn't know why I'd chosen that particular sentiment, but Eric's expression didn't change. If anything, his jaw tightened slightly, and his hand, still resting so close to mine, curled into a loose fist. He exhaled softly, almost a sigh. "Jason trusts a lot of people," he replied. His tone wasn't bitter, but there was a weight to it that made me wonder just how much he was holding back. "But this isn't about Jason." The statement felt final, like a door swinging shut. I searched his face for any sign of doubt, but there was none. Just that steady, quiet determination that had always set him apart from Jason's breezy confidence. "I know," I said, my voice quieter than I intended, but it carried more meaning than I expected, because I did know, and it terrified me. Eric didn't move at first, but then his fingers unfolded, brushing mine again, a deliberate action this time. It was like he was testing the water, waiting to see if I'd pull away. When I didn't, his hand shifted, his palm pressing against mine, warm and firm. "I'm sorry," he said suddenly, his voice breaking the silence, but his hand didn't move. "I didn't come here to make you uncomfortable." "You didn't," I replied quickly, maybe too quickly because his lips curved into a faint, rueful smile. "That's kind of you to say," he murmured, and then he finally pulled his hand back, retreating just enough to leave me feeling the absence of his touch like a phantom sensation. "But we both know this isn't simple." "No," I agreed, my throat dry. "It's not." We sat in silence for a while after that. The only sound, the faint hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the floorboards as one of us shifted. The room felt too small, too warm, but I couldn't bring myself to get up, to break whatever fragile thread tethered us in this moment. When Eric finally spoke again, his voice was low, almost hesitant. "I've never been good at saying the right thing." "You're doing fine," I said, and it came out softer than I intended. "You don't have to try so hard." His gaze lifted to mine, and there was something raw in his expression, like he was standing on the edge of a precipice waiting for me to push him or pull him back. And in that moment I realized I was standing there with him, caught in the same terrible, beautiful uncertainty. "I don't want to be that guy," he said, and his voice cracked slightly on the last word. "You know, the one who—" "You're not," I interrupted, not even letting him finish. I wasn't sure why I said it, whether it was to reassure him or myself, but it was the truth. Whatever this was, it wasn't manipulative or predatory or any of the other things society might have labeled it. It was just complicated. He nodded, but his jaw was still tight, and his hands, resting on the table now, were clenched into loose fists. I wanted to reach out, to touch him, to tell him that it was okay, but I wasn't sure if it was. Not yet. "I think I should go," he said finally, though he made no move to get up. "You don't have to." The words slipped out before I could stop them, and when his eyes met mine, they were full of something I couldn't name but felt deeply in my chest. "You mean that?" he asked, and there was a vulnerability in his voice that made my heart ache. "I do," I said, and it was true. I didn't want him to leave. Not like this. Not when it felt like we were on the verge of something that might never come again. He exhaled slowly, like he was releasing a breath he hadn't realized he was holding, and then he leaned back in his chair, his posture finally relaxing. "Okay," he said. Just that one word, but it carried so much weight that it felt like a decision had been made, like we'd both silently agreed to see where this would go, even if neither of us knew what it would look like. The hours that followed were a blur of quiet conversations and stolen glances, the tension between us simmering just below the surface. I found myself leaning closer without meaning to, laughing at things that weren't that funny, just to hear the sound of his voice. And he watched me. Not in the way Jason did, with casual appreciation, but with an intensity that made me feel like the only person in the room. When the clock struck midnight, I realized how late it had gotten, but neither of us seemed eager to end the evening. "Do you want to stay?" I asked, the question hanging in the air like a challenge. He hesitated, his eyes searching mine for what felt like an eternity. And then he nodded, a slow, deliberate motion that sent my heart racing. Eric's agreement hung in the air like an unspoken promise. There was no mistaking the shift between us now. The tension, which had been a quiet hum throughout the evening, had sharpened into something undeniable. My hands felt clammy as I reached for the empty coffee mugs to buy a moment to think, my heartbeat drumming loudly in my ears. "You don't have to," I said softly, unsure if I was offering him an out or myself. The words felt thin, stretched over the weight of what we both knew was happening. "I know." His reply was just as soft, his voice carrying a depth that settled somewhere low in my chest. He wasn't looking for an escape, and we both knew it. I moved to the sink, rinsing out the mugs under the stream of water more for the distraction than necessity. The quiet was heavy, the kind that felt more like a presence than an absence. I could feel him behind me, the weight of his gaze as tangible as a touch, and my pulse quickened. When I turned around, Eric hadn't moved. He was leaning back against the counter, arms crossed loosely over his chest, his expression unreadable. But his eyes, they were locked on me, unrelenting and searching, and I couldn't bring myself to look away. "It's late," I said finally, the words weak and wavering in the charged silence. "Yeah," he agreed, though he didn't move an inch. I took a step toward him, hesitant but drawn forward by something I couldn't name. "If you stay—" I trailed off, not even sure how to finish the sentence. What was I offering? What was I asking? Eric uncrossed his arms, his posture shifting as he straightened. His eyes softened, but the intensity in his gaze didn't falter. "Do you want me to?" The question hit me harder than I expected, as though he was stripping away every pretense, every polite deflection. I swallowed hard, suddenly acutely aware of how close we were standing. Too close, and yet not nearly close enough. "Yes," I said before I could overthink it. The word was quiet, but it carried a finality that made my chest feel tight. He stepped closer, just a fraction of an inch, but it was enough to make my breath hitch. The air between us felt electric, alive with possibilities we were both afraid to name. His gaze dropped to my mouth for the briefest moment, and I felt my heart lurch in response. "You don't have to be afraid," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. The words were meant to comfort, but they only amplified the tension. "I'm not afraid," I replied, though it was half a lie. I wasn't afraid of him. I was afraid of how much I wanted this, how much I wanted him. And the way he was looking at me now, like I was the only thing in the world that mattered, wasn't helping. Eric reached out, his movements slow and deliberate, giving me every chance to step back. But I didn't. His hand brushed my arm, the lightest of touches, and I felt a shiver race through me. "I don't want to do anything you'll regret," he said, and there was an earnestness in his voice that made my throat tighten. "I won't," I said, surprising myself with how certain I sounded. That was all he needed. He closed the distance between us in one smooth motion, his hand moving to the small of my back as his other cupped the side of my face. His touch was warm, steady, and when his lips finally met mine, it felt like the culmination of something that had been building for far too long. The kiss was tentative at first, almost hesitant, as though we were both testing the waters, but it didn't take long for the restraint to melt away. His hand slid up to the back of my neck, pulling me closer, and I felt myself lean into him without a second thought. There was a softness to the way he kissed me, but beneath it was a hunger, a need that mirrored my own. My hands found their way to his shoulders, clutching at the fabric of his shirt as though I needed the anchor. His lips were warm, insistent, and I could feel the faint scrape of stubble against my skin, a sensation that sent a thrill through me. The world outside seemed to fade away, leaving only the heat of his touch and the press of his body against mine. When we finally broke apart, both of us breathless, he didn't pull away. His forehead rested against mine, his breath warm against my lips. "I've wanted to do that for longer than I care to admit," he murmured, his voice rough with emotion. "Me too," I admitted, my hands still clinging to him as though I was afraid he might vanish if I let go. His lips found mine again, this time with more urgency, and I felt my heart race as I kissed him back just as fervently. His hands moved to my waist, steady and grounding, and I let out a soft sigh as he pulled me closer. We moved together without thinking, as though we'd done this 1,000 times before. The edge of the counter pressed into my back, but I barely noticed, too caught up in the heat of his touch, the way his hands slid over my hips, down my back. "Is this okay?" he asked against my lips, his voice barely audible. "Yes," I whispered, my answer coming without hesitation. It was more than okay. It was everything I hadn't realized I'd been yearning for. The room felt smaller, the air warmer as the moments blurred together. His hands were everywhere, gentle but insistent, and I couldn't get enough of him. Every touch, every kiss, every shiver that ran down my spine felt like a revelation, and I wondered how I'd managed to go so long without this, without him. He lifted me onto the counter in one smooth motion, his strength catching me off guard but thrilling me at the same time. His body pressed against mine, and I felt a heat building between us that was impossible to ignore. I tangled my fingers in his hair, pulling him closer as our kisses deepened. There was no room for hesitation now, no second-guessing. We were past the point of no return, and I didn't want to go back. Eric's weight against me was steady and grounding, but his movements were anything but. Every touch, every shift, carried a deliberate intent that made my pulse race faster. His lips trailed down my neck, warm and insistent, and I tilted my head back, surrendering to the sensation. My breath hitched when his teeth grazed the sensitive skin just below my jaw, a soft sound escaping me before I could stop it. He pulled back slightly, just enough to look at me, his eyes dark and questioning. "Is this too much?" he asked, his voice rough but steady, like he was willing to stop everything if I asked him to. "No," I managed, my voice trembling with the force of my own want. "It's not enough." His breath caught, and then he kissed me again, harder this time, as if the words had snapped some fragile thread of control he'd been holding on to. His hands moved down, gripping my waist as he pulled me closer, the heat of his body seeping into mine through the thin barrier of fabric between us. My hands slid under his shirt, the warmth of his skin sending a fresh wave of heat coursing through me. He shivered under my touch, his muscles tensing as my fingers traced the lines of his back. I could feel the sharp intake of his breath against my lips, the way his body leaned into mine as though the closeness wasn't nearly close enough. The counter was cold beneath me, but it only heightened the contrast to the heat radiating between us. He tugged at the hem of my shirt, his fingers brushing against bare skin, and I lifted my arms without hesitation, letting him pull it over my head. The look in his eyes when he saw me, reverent, hungry, made my cheeks flush, and I couldn't resist pulling him back to me, needing to feel his lips on mine again. His kisses grew deeper, more urgent, and I felt myself getting lost in him, in the way his hands roamed over my body like he couldn't decide where to touch first. My own hands were just as greedy, exploring the planes of his chest, the curve of his shoulders, memorizing every detail like it was the last time I'd ever get the chance. We were both trembling, our breaths ragged as we clung to each other. The intensity of it all, the heat, the tension, the way our bodies fit together like they'd been made for this, was overwhelming, and I felt like I was teetering on the edge of something I couldn't quite name. "Eric," I whispered, my voice catching on his name. He paused, pulling back just enough to meet my gaze. His expression was open, raw, and I could see the vulnerability there, the unspoken question he didn't dare put into words. "I'm here," he said softly, his hands cupping my face as though I was something fragile, something precious. "I've got you." The tenderness in his voice undid me, and I leaned into him, my forehead resting against his as I tried to steady my breathing. "I don't want this to stop," I admitted, the words spilling out before I could think better of them. "Neither do I," he murmured, his lips brushing against mine in the lightest of kisses. "But I need you to tell me if it's too much. If..." "It's not," I said, cutting him off. I didn't want to talk about what this meant or where it was going. I just wanted him. Now I tugged at his shirt and he got the message, pulling it over his head in one swift motion before returning to me. His skin was warm under my hands, smooth and solid, and I couldn't stop myself from running my fingers over every inch of him. The way his muscles tensed under my touch sent a thrill through me, and I felt a sense of power in knowing I could affect him like this. His hands slid down to my thighs, gripping them firmly as he pulled me even closer to the edge of the counter. The movement pressed us together in a way that made my breath catch, and I let out a soft gasp, my nails digging into his shoulders. He kissed me again, slower this time, but no less intense. It felt like he was trying to pour everything he couldn't say into that kiss, every unspoken desire, every repressed feeling, and I kissed him back just as fervently, hoping he could feel the same in my response. His hands roamed lower, gripping my hips as he pressed his forehead against mine. "You're driving me insane," he muttered, his voice thick with want. "Good," I teased, though my own voice was shaky. "I like you like this." His laugh was low, breathless, and it sent a shiver through me. "You have no idea what you're doing to me." "Then show me," I challenged, my words bolder than I felt. His expression darkened, a spark of mischief lighting in his eyes, and suddenly his grip tightened on my hips, pulling me flush against him. I gasped at the contact, the heat between us almost unbearable now, and I saw the satisfied smirk that curved his lips. Time seemed to blur as we lost ourselves in each other. The lines between where I ended and he began became meaningless, and all that mattered was the way he made me feel. Wanted, seen, cherished. I clung to him like he was the only thing keeping me grounded, my fingers tangling in his hair as his lips moved down my neck. "Eric," I breathed, his name a plea on my lips. "Say it again," he whispered, his voice rough as his hands slid up my back, leaving a trail of fire in their wake. "Eric," I said, louder this time, and the way his eyes darkened made my heart skip a beat. We were beyond words now, the tension building to a crescendo that neither of us could hold back. The room felt impossibly warm, the air between us charged with a kind of electricity that made every touch, every kiss, feel like a revelation. And when we finally crossed that invisible line, it wasn't just a moment. It was a breaking point, a release of everything we'd been holding back. The line, once crossed, left no room for hesitation, no space for doubt. We moved together with an intensity that felt almost desperate, like the culmination of something inevitable. Every touch, every kiss, every whispered name carried the weight of all the moments that had led us here. Eric's hands moved to cradle my face, grounding me as his lips found mine again. This time, the kiss was slower, deeper, less urgent, but no less passionate. His forehead rested against mine when we broke apart, our breaths mingling in the small space between us. "You okay?" he asked softly, his voice rough but steady. I nodded, my hands still clutching at his shoulders as though letting go would send me tumbling into the abyss. "More than okay," I whispered, the words barely audible but enough to make his lips twitch into the faintest of smiles. For a moment, we just held each other, the silence between us heavy with the unspoken. The world outside felt impossibly far away, and I wasn't ready to let it intrude. Not yet. Eventually, the tension eased, giving way to something softer, more tender. Eric's fingers traced idle patterns on my back, the motion soothing in its simplicity. I leaned against him, my head resting on his shoulder, and let myself breathe. "This wasn't supposed to happen," I murmured, though there was no regret in my tone. It was a statement, not an apology. "I know," he replied, his voice just as quiet. His hand stilled on my back, and I felt him take a deep breath. "But I don't think I can pretend it didn't." I pulled back slightly, just enough to look up at him. His expression was open, raw, and it took my breath away. "Me neither," I admitted, the words heavier than I expected. The corner of his mouth lifted in a faint smile, and he brushed a stray strand of hair from my face. "What now?" It was the question I'd been dreading, but there was no avoiding it. I hesitated, searching his face for something, an answer, maybe, or reassurance. Instead, I found the same uncertainty that was knotting my stomach, and somehow that made it easier to speak. "We figure it out," I said finally, "one step at a time." He nodded, the tension in his shoulders easing slightly. "Okay," he said, and it was a promise as much as an agreement. For the first time since he'd walked through my door, the weight of everything didn't feel so crushing. There was still uncertainty, still questions without answers, but there was also something else. A quiet hope that maybe, just maybe, we could make sense of this. The sound of a clock ticking somewhere in the background broke the silence, grounding me in the present. I slid off the counter, my legs shaky but steady enough to hold me. Eric's hands lingered on my waist as though he wasn't ready to let go just yet. "Do you want to stay?" I asked, the words coming out more tentative than I intended. He tilted his head, studying me for a long moment. "Do you want me to?" "Yes," I said, and this time there was no hesitation, no doubt. We spent the rest of the night in a quiet bubble, the tension between us replaced by a tentative closeness that felt fragile but unbreakable at the same time. We talked about nothing and everything, our words filling the spaces that had once been heavy with silence. When I finally fell asleep, my head resting on his shoulder, I felt something I hadn't in a long time, a sense of rightness, however fleeting it might be. The morning came too soon, sunlight streaming through the blinds and casting long shadows across the room. Eric stirred beside me, his movements slow and reluctant. For a moment, neither of us said anything, the weight of the day settling over us like a heavy blanket. "I should go," he said finally, his voice low but firm. I nodded, though the thought of him leaving left an ache in my chest. "You don't have to." He smiled, soft and bittersweet, and brushed his fingers against my cheek. "You know I do, but I'll be back, if you want me to be." "I do," I said without hesitation, my voice steady despite the lump in my throat. He leaned in, pressing a lingering kiss to my forehead before pulling away. "One step at a time," he reminded me, echoing my own words from the night before. I watched him leave, the door clicking softly behind him, and let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. The room felt emptier without him, but it wasn't a sad emptiness. It was the kind that carried possibility, like the first blank page of a story yet to be written. And as I stood there, bathed in the quiet light of morning, I realized that whatever came next, whatever challenges we faced or lines we crossed, it had already changed me in ways I couldn't begin to name. Eric was gone, but he wasn't far, and neither was the promise of something more.